On a fateful Friday, Charles Kane walked into the Rooster Bar with a frown on his face. He had never gotten drunk in his 29 years, but it looked like that would change tonight. He wanted to forget his wife of 6 years, Sugar Kane Kowalczyk, known in the business as Melissa Kowalczyk, although her real name since she married Charles had been Melissa Kane Kowalczyk, but to all her friends she was known only as Sugar. More accurately, Charles wanted to forget, at least until he came face to face with her later, what Sugar was probably doing at the very time he walked into Rooster's Bar. His first beer, not just this evening, but in 6 or 7 years, had tasted as bitter as he remembered it. He wondered how he could get intoxicated drinking that horse piss, considering how hard it was to swallow if he let it touch his taste buds. Maybe I should switch to something stronger, he thought to himself, but quickly dismissed the thought as he needed to prolong his binge to help him forget about what Sugar was up to. As he finished his second mug of beer at the bar, his malaise not going away, he saw a table for two had become vacant, and shuffling his feet, he walked over to it to be more inconspicuous. For although he needed the buzz of human activity, he didn't want human interaction, for fear of ruining someone's day with his moodiness. Then he saw her, Norma Desmond. Why the hell is the wife of Joe Desmond, a wealthy lawyer, one of my longtime acquaintances, working as a waitress in a bar? He asked himself. However, it was not the question that most alarmed him when he met Norma. He was alarmed because Norma had been his secret crush since he had met her about 5 years ago. For reasons he couldn't adequately explain, she was the woman of his dreams. The only woman besides Sugar who not only rang his bells but played Flight of the Bumblebee on them. Despite his usual perky manner, Charles always seemed obliquely tongue-tied in her presence, and she seemed to enjoy it. Charles was a psychologist by profession, having earned a master's degree in psychology from the University of Southern California. His specialty was body language, which he had learned through observation while still in elementary school, long before he began studying it academically. He was one of the few true experts in the country on all aspects of body language, including kinesics, facial expressions and gestures, oculesics, eye movement, tactility, touch, and provenix, spatial relationships. His grateful clients have included law enforcement, government negotiators, large corporations, and individuals with personal relationship problems. He had a policy not to use his professional expertise in public situations or in his personal relationships, and he violated that policy only with his wife, Sugar, and Norma. Sugar's words were easy to understand, and that was the source of his frustration that night at the Rooster Bar. Norma, on the other hand, was one of about half a dozen people since he'd begun his psychological practice whose body language he couldn't read correctly. For example, she was the only person whose eyes would get wrinkles whether she was smiling happily or pretending to smile. This created an air of mystery around her and probably increased his attraction to her. Charles gathered his wits as Norma approached his table. "Hello, Killer Kane," she said with a smile. It was her joking nickname for him, hugging him at the same time. "What brings you to Roosters?" Not wanting to reveal the reason for his presence here, Charles overcame his usual lack of eloquence in Norma's presence and asked her back. More importantly, what does a rich woman do when she's serving tables at a bar? Norma laughed. "My brother, Rick Blaine, owns this wonderful establishment. I worked here during college to earn money for expenses. Tonight he was short 2 waitresses due to illness, and Joe was out of town for a lawsuit, so I offered my help. My biological family is important to me," she grinned. "Wow, what a good sister. If it's not too much trouble, could you bring me some onion rings?" "I promise a big tip," Charles replied with a chuckle of his own. "Only if you promise not to kiss me with your onion breath," Norma giggled as she pinched his cheek and then walked away. Charles's mood had only improved slightly after his brief interaction with the woman he had been dreaming of. It made him think about how different the only 2 women he had truly desired in his adult life were in appearance. Sugar was a large, full-breasted blonde, while Norma was a petite brunette whose cup size would have been the highest grade on a high school exam. What they had in common, however, were large, for their size, round asses and nearly perfect pelvises and hips. He knew why he was attracted, at least until recently, to Sugar, but he wasn't sure why he was attracted to Norma. Maybe it was the curve of her back, the way she flicked her hair back from her face with a swift movement of her head, the strength of her practically black irises, or her pheromones, most likely in a combination of all of these. He also thought briefly about their different personalities. Sugar was flirtatious and mercurial. Norma was slightly sultry and straightforward. With his mood slightly improved, brought on primarily by the opportunity to watch Norma wag her pretty ass around the establishment and her frequent approaches to his table for a quick, friendly chat, Charles decided not to get drunk off his ass. Although he continued to order beer from his favorite waitress of all time, he poured most of it into the boxes of live plants set up around the perimeter of the bar. Thankfully, he was alert rather than drunk when, after he'd been there for about an hour and a half, a swarthy guy in a hooded sweatshirt walked into the bar just as Norma was bringing him another mug. Charles got up from his stool just before Norma arrived and, trying not to stare at the new customer, whispered to Norma, "This is no joke. I realize from his body language and appearance that the guy in the hooded sweatshirt, don't look right away, is probably a suicide bomber. When I pounce on him, get everyone out of here within 20 meters of the entrance and call 911 for police and ambulance." Norma's smile was quickly replaced by displeasure. Charles didn't need to be a body language expert to spot the surprise, worry, and horror on her face. "Do it," he murmured, squeezing her elbow. Charles was a big, strong, and fast guy. As a senior, he had been a second-team All-American lacrosse player in Duke's national championship. He moved with the speed of a midfielder to a position behind the guy in the hoodie and clutched his right arm with both hands. Charles quickly saw that he was right in believing that the actuator on the right side of the hoodie was the suicide switch. So he needed to hold on to it because if he let go, the bomb in the vest would explode. As soon as the guy in the hoodie fell to the floor and Charles was on top of him, Norma screamed over and over again, "Bomber, bomber, get the hell out now." At first, the noise in the bar just died down. After a few seconds, a mass exodus began when they saw Charles lying on the floor. Norma ran up to her brother, Rick Blaine, and screamed, "Call the police, bomb squad, and ambulance." The bar was cleared in less than 2 minutes. Norma stepped outside and shouted to the crowd gathered at the entrance, "Move back 20 meters. If there is an explosion, you will be in danger here." Norma bravely ran back in to see how Charles was doing. So far, he had the guy under control. The guy was fighting back desperately and seemed almost as big and strong as Charles. Even a second loosening of Charles's grip could have gotten him killed and destroyed the bar. "Norma, when the paramedics get here, have them inject this guy with sleeping pills and have the bomb squad go in as soon as they get here." "Got it," Norma replied. "Now get the hell out of here and don't come back," Charles growled. Although it was probably only a few minutes, it seemed like hours to Charles and Norma before the paramedics and the first wave of police got there. When Norma told the paramedics what Charles needed, they pulled a syringe out of the first aid kit but said, "We can't do anything until the bomb squad gets here. By then it may be too late." "My friend can't hold this guy off much longer," Norma yelled. "I'm sorry lady, we can't do that," the male paramedic said. While Rick was trying to talk to the paramedic to convince him to help Charles, Norma grabbed the syringe out of the paramedic's hands, dodged the cop trying to stop her and ran back to the Rooster Bar. "Where do I inject him?" she asked Charles, who was drenched in sweat but still holding his composure. "Pull back his sweatshirt and see if there's an open blood vessel in his neck and inject there," Charles replied, panting, not bothering to ask why Norma had the syringe and not the paramedic. Norma did as she was asked, saw a large, easily accessible blood vessel and emptied the syringe. "Get your knees on his head for a minute or so," Charles exhaled as the suicide bomber twitched. Norma again did as she was asked. After about 60 seconds, the bomber stopped moving. "Now get out and get the bomb squad as soon as they arrive," Charles ordered. Norma obeyed again. About 10 minutes later, the bomb squad arrived there. 2 policemen in suits entered the bar. Charles quickly outlined the situation to them. They confirmed that it was the suicide bomber who was still clutching the starter in his right hand and which Charles clutched with both hands. After a minute or two of observation, they cut some wires and then said to Charles, "You can let go now." Charles's hands were cramped and his whole body was wet with sweat, but otherwise he felt fine. The relief of being alive could lead to this, combined with such a serious distraction that he had no time to think about his wayward lying wife. When the bomb squad reported that all was clear, half a dozen police officers rushed in, arrested the still unconscious terrorist who was stripped of his vest and placed in an explosive ordnance disposal container, and offered to help Charles, whose knees were buckling a little, to get out of the bar. As he got out, cheers erupted in the crowd, and Norma ran up to Charles and threw her 100-pound body into the arms of his 100-pound friend, thankfully without knocking him down, covering his sweaty face, lips, and neck with kisses. A smiling policewoman gently reprimanded them, found a room, separated them, and led them to the squad car at the scene. As they walked to the squad car, a tall guy in a rumpled suit stood in front of Norma and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I have to arrest you for unlawful use of a controlled substance." Charles's mood suddenly changed from joyful to somber. He stood in front of the man in the suit and stared angrily into his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Detective Harold Callahan," the man in the suit growled, showing his badge. "Well, Harold," Charles growled, "this woman saved my life and prevented the entire building the bar was in from collapsing, if not the surrounding buildings. So the only way to arrest her is through my dead or unconscious body. Let's see how this affects your career and the image of the police department." Shortly before Charles and Callahan confronted each other, Captain Jerome McKay intervened. "It's all right, Harry," he said to Callahan. "No one but the terrorist will be arrested." Callahan didn't like his objections being overruled, but he backed down. The police took Norma and Charles to headquarters in a squad car and then questioned them separately for over an hour. With District Attorney Jack McCoy present for Charles's questioning and Assistant District Attorney Alexandra Borja present for Norma's questioning. After they had been there only about 20 minutes, the attorneys hired by Norma's brother, Rick Blaine, showed up. Charles refused to represent himself. "I'm just a witness," he smiled at one lawyer, while Norma allowed another lawyer to be present just to reassure her brother. Both Norma and Charles were informed that the explosive vest the bomber was wearing contained enough PE4, British rough equivalent of C4, to kill everyone in the bar and bring the entire building down. When Norma and Charles finished their interrogations, Rick, who had been waiting patiently for them in the lobby of the police station, drove them back to their cars. As Rick parted from them, tears came to his eyes as he hugged his little sister, by far the bravest member of the family. Tears were still in his eyes as he turned to Charles, gasping, "Dude, if you ever need anything, if it's within my power, just ask and it'll be done." "Okay, pay for my beer and onion rings tonight," Charles grinned. "That's just the beginning," Rick laughed through his tears. After Rick left, Norma turned to Charles and seductively placed her hand on his bare chest just below his neck. Charles didn't need to be a body language expert to realize what Norma meant. "You know, Killer Kane, I'm really tired, but I find that tiredness is a great aphrodisiac. Let's go to my house," she said in the most passionate voice Charles had ever heard. "What about Joe?" Charles asked. "He didn't save my life or the lives of countless others," she chuckled. "What about Sugar?" he asked. "Not only did she not save your life, but you were at the bar to forget about her cheating on you. So what about her?" Norma chuckled again. Charles started to ask, "Why do you say that?" But all he managed was, "Why," before she pressed her index finger to his lips. "Since your little friend enthusiastically greets me every time he sees me, are you really going to turn me down when I want to fuck you the best way I can in your life?" She giggled again. 15 minutes later, they were showering together in Norma's guest bathroom, squirming and exchanging spit more than washing up. Still not completely dry, a few minutes afterward, Charles was sitting on the bed in the guest room and Norma was sitting on Charles's lap facing him. The two lovers eventually pulled away temporarily, got under the covers, and then with second and third impulses they had never had before, made love again. As the sun's rays penetrated Norma's guest bedroom, whose windows faced east, Charles finally moved. Norma was lying on his shoulder and had probably remained that way since they had made love. His movement made her open her eyes. She smiled up at him. "I bet I look intimidating, like I've been had all night," she said, and then there was a chuckle. "Oh wait, you have." After some joking teasing, Charles said seriously, "You're inimitable, Norma, really inimitable. I've never had anything better in my life from the moment we were in your shower until today. Is there any way to get rid of Sugar and steal you away from Joe? Giving up Sugar is your own business. As for stealing me away from Joe, I don't think he'd be upset if I left him. He's so busy with himself and his career that we haven't cuddled, let alone slept together, in at least a month. I really needed you last night, and if what we have in the future is even a quarter of what we had last night, I'll leave him and be in your bed as fast as humanly possible, killer," she sighed. "Doesn't it bother you that we're both traitors?" Frowning, Charles asked. "What we did last night was just a thank you to each other for saving each other's lives. We're not going to sleep again until we both tell our spouses that we're leaving them. That is, if you want me instead of Sugar," Norma replied with a smile. Charles smiled. "Do you think we can consider this morning just a continuation of our thank yous?" he inquired devilishly. "I think so," Norma murmured, kissing Charles. Charles arrived home around 11 a.m. on Saturday morning. On the drive from Norma's house, his thoughts were clouded with many things. When he reflected on it, he was still shaken by the almost disaster at the bar, but understandably proud of the way he had handled the situation. He didn't really think about it too much, however, because his thoughts were preoccupied with what an amazing woman of his dreams Norma Desmond was and how she had sexually satisfied him in ways that he hadn't realized were possible. These pleasant thoughts were interrupted periodically by an upcoming run-in with his darling wife, Sugar Cane Kowalczyk. As Charles drove up to his house, he saw Sugar peering out of the living room window. Just then, his cell phone rang and the display showed the 212 area code and the Tonight Show. Intrigued, he answered with a simple, "Hello." "Hello, is this Charles Kane?" came the melodious female voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, who is this?" was Charles's reply. "This is Lizzie Borden, executive producer of The Tonight Show in New York," was the cheerful reply. "How did you get my cell phone number, Lizzie?" "From Rick Blaine, of course. He really likes you, by the way." Charles didn't remember giving Rick his cell phone number, but of course, Norma had it and she could have given it to him. "So why did you call, Lizzie?" "I think you can guess. We love having real American heroes on The Tonight Show and we'd love to see you early next week. Our standard procedure is to cover all travel and lodging expenses for 1 or 2 nights. For us, Charles, Tuesday or Wednesday would be best." "I don't know, Lizzie. I'm not sure I want exposure or hero worship." Charles started to reply but immediately turned his head to see what that loud noise was behind him and noticed that 2 news trucks had pulled up to his house. One with CNN on the side and one with ABC on the side, both with satellite dishes on top. "Hold on a second, Lizzie. I need to go inside. A couple of news carts just pulled up. Is your correct number on my caller ID? I'll call you back." "Yeah, that's the best number to reach me at. Please call me back. I don't want to bother you, but I'll come after you if you don't contact me." Lizzie grinned. "I'll call you within 2 hours, I promise," Charles replied before ending the conversation and hurrying into the house. Sugar, who was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest, asked Charles sharply, "Where have you been?" And Charles replied, "Where have you been?" Obviously you haven't listened to the news or read today's paper, have you, dear? Charles added, using the word darling with a touch of sarcasm. Sugar looked puzzled. Look at the 2 news trucks outside the house. They're wondering what I did last night too, Charles growled. Why don't you tell them about how you slept with Norman Bates while I tell them about the incident at Rooster's bar? The color drained from Sugar's face. I don't know what you're talking about, she said defensively. Honey, have you forgotten what my profession is? I don't normally use my experience reading body language to assess personal relationships. But our conversation last night at noon, before you went to work, gave me an accurate idea of what you were going to do last night. I still don't know what the hell you're talking about, Sugar protested, stomping her foot on the floor and blushing even more. Well, let's see, Charles replied sarcastically, stroking his chin emphatically. When I talked to you about why you wouldn't be home until midnight and what you'd be doing, I could tell by your body language that you were lying. Remember how vague you were without going into detail when I asked you about where you'd be and who you'd be with? He asked rhetorically. Sugar's eyes widened. Remember how you repeated my questions before answering them? Remember how you spoke in sentence fragments? Remember how you didn't provide specific details when I refuted your story about Norman Bates not being there and how you played with your hair while talking to me? Charles continued. These are all classic signs of lying. Sugar, my dear, and yours were the most candid I've ever seen. It wasn't a surprise, though, since you've been gradually lying to me more and more over the past 6 months. Sugar's eyes grew wider with each rhetorical question. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything. Don't even try to answer, darling. While you were sleeping with Norman Bates, all I was doing was trying to stop a suicide bomber from blowing up the Rooster Bar, an establishment where I went to get drunk in an attempt to drown out the sadness of having such a cheating bitch of a wife. Charles cut her off. The doorbell rang. Charles turned away from Sugar, who was still sitting with her mouth hanging open, and opened the door. Before the CNN and ABC reporters could speak, he raised his hand and said, I won't be making any statements to the press just yet. I'm still in shock from what happened last night, and my mind is clouded. Of course, you can get most of what you need from the police reports. But Mr. Kane, CNN reporter Dexter Morgan protested, the public wants to hear your point of view. They're dying for a lack of information. I'll make a statement with Mrs. Desmond tomorrow. If you give me your business cards, I promise to call you, Charles replied. Morgan handed over his business card, as did ABC reporter Albert DeSalvo. Thank you, now please leave. I need to comfort my distraught wife, Charles said, laughing and closing the door. On the second floor, Sugar was nowhere to be seen. Charles ran into the master bedroom and saw Sugar sitting on the bed with tears in her eyes. Charles Kane got straight to the point. It's over between us, Sugar. When I get back from filming The Tonight Show next week, I want you gone. But, Sugar started to protest. But nothing, shouted Charles. We're done, period. And tell your little friend Norman Bates that his time has come. I would never physically hurt a woman, but he's going to experience real physical pain, much more than I inflicted on the suicide bomber at Rooster's Bar. Sugar's sobs made background noise as Charles waddled to the backyard to call Norma. Hi, Norma, and no, I'm not going to fill your ego with any more stories about what a sex goddess you are, Charles grinned. Take them and make them want more, killer, Norma grinned back. Something along those lines. Anyway, my call has 2 purposes. 1, I told Sugar that she and I are over, and we are. 2nd, we're invited to The Tonight Show Tuesday or Wednesday morning. Do you want to go? We could spend a couple nights together playing hide the salami in a New York hotel if you break up with Joe by then. No shit, Norma laughed. I'll call Joe tonight. And yes, I'd like to go on The Tonight Show. Wednesday morning would be best for me. Okay, unless I'm calling you back to tell you something different, plan to spend Tuesday and Wednesday nights at the hotel so we can find all the erogenous zones on each other's bodies. Charles snorted. That could take more than 2 nights, dude, Norma giggled. And one more thing. I promised we'd do a joint statement for CNN and ABC tomorrow. Charles immediately called Lizzie Borden back. All right, Lizzie, here's the deal. Take it or leave it. Norma Desmond, who played as big a role in saving the Rooster Bar and its patrons as I did, and I will be present for a preliminary interview Tuesday afternoon and on the show Wednesday morning. We are entering into a comprehensive agreement. In addition to our expenses, by the way, we only need 1 hotel room. You will make a $25,000 donation to an international charity of our choice. We don't usually do that, Lizzie started to protest. What you normally do is not important to me, Lizzie. If you really want this story, I will first talk in detail to CNN and ABC, who are already knocking on my door. You do that or I'll talk to them instead. Call me back within the hour and let me know if we have a deal, Charles concluded. Wait, that won't be necessary, Lizzie replied. Okay, we have a deal. Send me an email confirming the deal. My email address, Charles started to say. We already have one, Lizzie grinned. It'll be there within the hour, along with flight details and hotel accommodations for you and Mrs. Desmond. Norma and Charles's joint statement to CNN, ABC, CBS, and Al Jazeera the next day was short and sweet, and they answered only one question each. Norma called Joe on Saturday afternoon. Sorry to interrupt your trial preparations, Joe, but something came up. You may have seen it on the news. You know I'm too busy to follow the news, Joe quipped. Yeah, that's what I thought. I don't want to bore you, but Charles Kane and I saved my brother's bar and the lives of about 60 people in it from a suicide bomber. What the fuck? Are you delusional? What are you talking about, Norma? Go on Yahoo and search for Rooster's Bar and suicide bomber and you'll see. By the way, I'm leaving you for Charles Kane. What the fuck? Are you trying to keep me from focusing on the trial? Despite what you think, not all of life revolves around your process, asshole. You haven't had time or interest in me in a long time. Charles does. Since we don't want to cheat, he advised, sugar, and I'm advising you that you're both done. Tomorrow, I intend to beat him to a pulp. No, you can't do that, Joe started to say. I just did. When you come back to town in 10 days, I won't be home. I hope your trial goes well. And with that, Norma hung up the phone. Her cell phone didn't answer when Joe appeared on the caller ID display. The interview that Norma and Charles did on Wednesday's Tonight Show went very well for them, almost as well as the Sex Fest party at the hotel on Tuesday night. Both Charles and Norma thought of each other as true heroes and were as humble as they could be, but without being fake. Charles did share some of his professional observations as a body language expert, but declined to name the most important body language feature that led him to think of a suicide bomber's hooded sweatshirt, lest another suicide bomber in the future practice it. After the interview, Charles and Norma had a fun day in New York, including a quick dinner and a Broadway show. That night, as they lay on a king-sized bed in a hotel in postcoital bliss, Norma asked, "Where are we going to move in when we get back?" Charles smiled, "Don't you think that's a little too hasty?" "Hell no," Norma grinned. "I knew what kind of man you were by your actions last week. While it was very impressive that you disarmed a suicide bomber, it was even more impressive that you stood up for me to Detective Harry Callahan. Your insistence that I participate as an equal partner in all discussions and interviews regarding the situation, and the fact that since the night of the incident, I have had 7 of the best lovemaking sessions of my life. I want to get used to being treated that way." Charles smiled. "Why aren't you interested in living together?" asked Norma with a sly grin. "In fact, my contained passion for you alone could keep me in blissful cohabitation with you for the next 25 years, not to mention my love for you, which grows exponentially every day." We've known each other and I've wanted you for 5 years, so I know who you are, and your actions on the night of the incident have only increased my reverence for you. In fact, I intend to ask you to marry me the second our 2 divorces become final." Charles smiled. In a serious tone, Norma replied, "I'll tell you what, why don't you propose now, counting on a second after our divorces become final, and see what the answer is." "Okay," Charles sighed. Taking a deep breath, he asked, "Norma, would you make me the happiest man in the world if you married me a second after we get divorced?" Norma replied, stroking her chin, "Let me give you a nonverbal answer, Killer Kane. You're the body language expert. Let's see if you can understand my answer from this." With those words, Norma lowered herself onto the bed. Charles and Norma Kane lived happily ever after and were attracted to each other. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.